It's an election that could bring major change to Venezuela. President Nicolas Maduro is seeking another 6 years in office. But after a decade of economic crisis, many are disillusioned with the country's socialist revolution. So, could it be near its end? And how's this vote being viewed in the region? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. It's being called the most consequential election in Venezuela in a generation. The opposition is hoping for an overwhelming victory that could force President Nicolas Maduro to negotiate a transition of power. The challenge is the biggest the country's socialist regime has faced in 25 years. Years of economic collapse and political repression have worn down the socialist revolution started by late President Hugo Chavez in 1999. The election campaign has been marred by claims of widespread harassment and the arrests of dozens of opposition activists. Institutions loyal to the president have not allowed millions of Venezuelans abroad to register to vote and barred the opposition primary winner from running. If Maduro is defeated, will he recognize the results or try to stay in power? And what does the outcome mean for Venezuela and the South America region? We'll discuss all that with our guests in a few moments, but first, this report from Victoria Gatenby.
After being in power for more than a decade in Venezuela, President Nicolas Maduro is seeking a third term. He's promising to continue the socialist revolution started by late President Hugo Chavez in 1999.
I am Nicolas Maduro Moras, President, people, and I will recognize the electoral referee, the official bulletins, and they will be respected. I call on the 10 presidential candidates to declare publicly that they will respect the official results.
But the opposition is hoping for an overwhelming victory. Many people say they're exhausted after years of economic collapse and political repression. Recent polls suggest around two-thirds of voters are likely to support any candidate but Maduro.
People should go out and vote. Voting is a right and a duty as well, and we need to slowly improve things. I hope everything goes smoothly, but essentially, I hope people go out and vote.
Venezuela's economy has been in crisis since the price of oil plunged around a decade ago, triggering hyperinflation and causing nearly 8 million people to leave the country. That crisis has been worsened by sanctions imposed by the United States in 2019. The US government blames Maduro and his administration for economic mismanagement and corruption.
The United States is not going to prejudge the outcome. This is a choice for Venezuelans to make. But the Venezuelan people deserve an election that genuinely reflects their will, free from any manipulation.
Opinion polls suggest opposition candidate Edmundo Gonzalez is the front-runner with a significant lead over Maduro. He says he'll lead what he calls a peaceful democratic transition in Venezuela and encourage those who've left to return, while being open to an amnesty for government officials being investigated for crimes. Rights groups are concerned the election won't be free or fair. Maria Corina Machado won the opposition primary with 93% of the vote, but has been banned from running. Maduro has warned the country could face a bloodbath if he's not re-elected and accuses Gonzalez of being a puppet of the United States. The election result is likely to have far-reaching consequences for Venezuela and the South America region. Victoria Gatenby, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
All right, let's go ahead and bring in our guests. In Caracas, Paola de Aleman is a Venezuelan opposition politician and academic. In Washington, D.C., David Smolansky is the former mayor of a Caracas district, now living in exile. He was also the former envoy for Venezuelan migration and refugee crisis for the Organization of American States. And in London, Christopher Sabatini is a senior fellow for Latin America at the Chatham House think tank and founder of the Americas Quarterly periodical dedicated to politics, business, and culture in the Americas. Thanks so much for joining us today, and we appreciate your time. David, let me start with you today. How consequential is this presidential election in Venezuela? How high are the stakes?
So high. It is historic. This election, it is an opportunity for us to start a transition to democracy, to recover our liberties, to provide the opportunity for more than 8 million people who have fled the country to go back and reunite with their families. And no one saw this day coming, but it has been epic. This campaign, even though all the repression and the violence that Maduro has promoted, with more than 120 activists, members of our team that have been illegally detained, but we're here. People are voting from very early in the morning, and hopefully we can start the transition this evening, because it will benefit Venezuelans and it will benefit the whole region.
David, let me just follow up with you, because this is the first time in years that all the opposition united, that they're not boycotting the elections in some form. How vigilant are they going to be able to be when it comes to guarding against any type of election or voter fraud? What steps is the opposition taking in order to try and ensure free and fair elections?
Well, these elections are not free. They are not fair. International observation is very limited. Only the Carter Center was allowed. We invited almost 100 international observers, members of parliament from Europe, from different countries of Europe, and former presidents, and all of them were deported. That was another atrocity that the regime did. However, we have built the strongest civic organization for any election ever in Venezuela. As we speak, we're having 600,000 Venezuelans deployed in every poll center. We're having poll watchers. We're having people mobilizing, and we're going to have people defending the votes. I mean, every poll said before this election that Edmundo Gonzalez was above Maduro 25, 30 points. And if everyone, as we're expecting, are going to vote today, we're going to win. And hopefully those results are going to be recognized by Maduro. We want an orderly and peaceful transition for our country.
Paola, the opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, she won the opposition primary with 93% of the vote, but she was banned earlier this year from running for president. Her campaign promise of reunification with family members, of making the country safe again and prosperous enough for all those millions who fled in the last several years to come back. How much is that at play in this election?
Well, I think that the role of Maria Corina Machado as our national leader, it's the key to success. She is the one who has been leading the country to this process. She, as you said, she was banned to run for the presidency. Now our candidate is Edmundo Gonzalez Urrutia, who has been campaigning with her around the country. And I think that her leadership, it's been quite important and relevant in all this process.
And Paola, let me just ask you, you mentioned Edmundo Gonzalez. He's the opposition candidate. He was an obscure retired diplomat, not very well known. He didn't really have political aspirations until this coalition of opposition parties picked him as their candidate. Now there are polls that have him potentially leading Maduro by 20 to 25%. How remarkable is the rise of Gonzalez in this election cycle?
Yes, as you said, Edmundo Gonzalez Urrutia 3 months ago was a retired ambassador here in Venezuela. He represented our country in different overseas, in different countries. And well, he became the candidate after Maria Corina Machado was banned. And all the success is because Maria Corina said he was his candidate and the country trusts her. And now we trust him.
Christopher, Maduro, he's warned that the country could face a bloodbath if he is not reelected. How much worry is there about the potential for violence if Maduro loses?
There's certainly the concern, but much of this will hinge on what the armed forces do. I think in part what he was trying to do in sending that message and actually frightening even his neighbors. You heard the ex-president of Argentina express his concern. The president of Brazil, who used to be an ally, made a joke. President Lula is known to be quite jovial in his remarks, said, I don't want to see a bloodbath, I want to see a bath of votes. He's alarmed people, but his capacity to implement that sort of agenda, first of all, indicates his unwillingness to yield power. And clearly, for perhaps good reason, there's a number of indictments against him, including in the International Criminal Court, but there's also a $15 million bounty on his head on the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration for narcotics trafficking. So he's clearly frightened to have to step down. But it's unclear whether, if it comes to this, whether the armed forces would stand by him. Obviously, over the last 25 years, the Maduro government and his predecessor, Hugo Chavez, have co-opted and corrupted and politicized the military. But it looks like, and I'll defer to my friends Paola and David, who are much closer to this, it looks like lower down in the rankings, whether it's non-commissioned officers or foot soldiers, it's not clear whether they actually support this government. So, whom he would unleash on his own people, we don't know, but it isn't clear that he's going to have the authority to do that or legitimacy to do that, given the very substantial lead that the opposition has, and also given the fact that the international community, despite the very limited presence it has, is some of them are on the ground and they're all paying attention.
Well, Christopher, you mentioned those warrants, those outstanding warrants for Maduro, and there has been some analysis in the past that perhaps if he were to lose, there were experts and analysts who said that maybe there could be outside players that could try to negotiate some terms for him to leave office. Maybe he could seek some kind of an amnesty. Do you think he'd be willing to do that? Is there anything that could happen by any outside players that would make him more amenable to departing office if he were to lose?
It's a good question, Mohammed. I would say first, there have been discussions, not just secret discussions between the U.S. and the government, but also with neighbors, Brazil and Colombia, that he'd get, if you will, a sort of get out of jail free pass. That's also will probably be extended to the 50 or so other government officials who are under sanctions. And that's going to be essential. You need to provide an exit ramp for some of these individuals so that the cost of leaving power are not so high that they cling to it by all means possible. Now, there are also a number of International Criminal Court indictments against Maduro and several members of the government for crimes against humanity. Those can't be wished away. They can't just, it is up to the ICC. However, there is a process that will allow the ICC to devolve the process of investigating to Venezuela if there's a credible process, a sort of Truth and Reconciliation Commission that may allow them to avoid conviction.
David, you heard Christopher there talk about what role the military might play going forward. From your vantage point, what do you think we could see happen if Maduro is to lose? There is a concern that there could be violence. Could some player step in to try to convince him to step away if he were to be defeated in this election?
Oh, that's a very important question. First of all, violence has been promoted by Maduro during the campaign. As I said earlier, more than 120 activists from civil society organizations and members from our team have been illegally detained. And 6 of them, by the way, are right now in a refugee status in an embassy in Caracas. We want peace. We want democracy. We want freedom. We want to have a country with access of justice and with the opportunity to have our family reunited. We hope that when the majority of the people today end voting and the results are given, Maduro will recognize and the armed forces need to obey the Constitution. That's the only request that we are doing. Obey the Constitution and respect what the majority are going to say today. If they do that, if they behave constitutionally, the transition to democracy in Venezuela will start. And as I said earlier, a transition to democracy in Venezuela won't only benefit Venezuelans, but will benefit the whole region. If Maduro prevails by force, I forecast that between 1 and 2 million people are going to flee the country. And we don't want that anymore.
Well, David, let me talk to you a little bit more about that issue, because since 2014, there's been more than 7.7 million people that have fled Venezuela. That's according to the UN Refugee Agency. That's one of the largest instances of mass displacement in modern history. And the opposition has made it a pillar of their campaign that if Maduro is defeated, that if the opposition prevails, that people will be able to come back, that there will be reunification, something we've touched upon in our conversation here today as well. How much is that something that is driving people to go out and vote? How much is hinging on that issue in this election?
So much. Every time that Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez were rallying the country during the campaign, you listen to grandparents that wanted their grandchildren back in Venezuela. You listen to mothers that wanted their kids go back to Venezuela. So definitely it's something so powerful. It has been something spontaneous from the people, because one of the most difficult things that we have suffered as Venezuelans with this regime is to have our families separated. And also let me add, because you asked me about which actors could play a key role this evening. And I think Brazil and Colombia play a key role today. As Chris said, both governments have distanced a little bit from Maduro, especially when Maduro said that if he loses, there's going to be a bloodbath. And they play a crucial role today on guaranteeing a peaceful and orderly transition, which, by the way, they are the two countries most affected with the migration, because Colombia has already more than 3 million Venezuelan migrants and refugees, and Brazil has more than 500,000, which, by the way, more than 100,000 out of that 500,000 landed to Brazil since Lula was elected president.
Christopher, I saw you reacting right now to what David was saying. It looked like you wanted to jump in, so I'm going to let you go ahead.
Thank you. I didn't want to have to jump in, but I will. No, I agree with David entirely. And this is what's interesting now is, Colombia and Brazil have, if you will, a stake here in a free and fair election. It's in part because there's the very real threat that if Maduro is reelected, according to surveys, between 20 to 30% of the people will leave. More will leave. This is a huge national embarrassment to Venezuela, to the government, and it should be. And so, Brazil and Colombia have been very good about opening up their borders, as David knows. He's worked with them, providing social services, helping them get residence cards. But there is a limited capacity of what these governments can absorb. And there's another issue here as well, as for President Lula of Brazil, who basically was able to assume office despite attempts to undermine the election by the outgoing President Bolsonaro, and despite Bolsonaro's incitement of a rebellion attempting to stage a coup shortly after Lula was inaugurated. This really strikes close to home. Lula and Maria Corina Machado may not have much in common ideologically, but they're both Democrats, and Lula really feels this very much in his own political history. So I think that, despite some misgivings about Lula's previous embrace of Hugo Chavez, I think you now see a real commitment on the part of the Brazilian government and the part of the Colombian government to make sure that electoral standards are met and that citizens' voices are heard in this election.
And Paola, I also saw you just now reacting to what Christopher was saying. It looked like you wanted to add to the point he was making, so please go ahead.
Yes, I just want to add that the positions of President Petro and President Lula reveals that the problem in Venezuela is not ideological. It's not about left and right. It's about democracy. It's about democracy and dictatorship. And we have democratic leaders in our neighborhood in Latin America that are making all the efforts to help Venezuelans to move forward democracy.
Paola, let me also ask you about something that both Christopher and David were touching on in their previous answers, which is this concern about how many more people may flee Venezuela if Maduro is reelected. There are polls out there suggesting that more than 30% of the country will leave if Maduro wins again. Do you think that is accurate?
I think that maybe are more. I have seen studies that says that 4 out of 10 Venezuelans will leave the country if Maduro remains in power. And the explanation of that reaction is poverty and misery. We have 6 out of 10 Venezuelans live under extreme poverty. And we have a humanitarian crisis, and living here is very hard. I'm in Caracas, and a lot of inequality, and it's something that it's new in our history because Venezuela, it's a oil country. We have oil, petroleum, and we are not used to have these levels of poverty. And that's why people decides to leave.
David, I want to go back to a point you were making earlier, because you were saying that the region, there's a lot of concern in the region about this election. And one of the concerns is what might happen if it is perceived that Maduro has stolen this election. There's not a lot of consensus right now that people believe that this will be a free and fair election. So what are the next steps? If people don't think it's a free and fair election, if it is perceived that Maduro has stolen the election, what happens?
Well, we hope that international community play a key role if that happens, right? You cannot have neutrality at this moment. The region knows very well what it means to have Maduro in power 6 more years. More people are going to flee. The security of the region also will be in danger. Democracy in the region will be threatened. And it's not what people think. I mean, I think everyone knows that this is not a free and fair election. Recently, 4th of July, there was an election in the UK. Everyone knew before that the Labour Party was going to win. They have probably the same advantage that Edmundo Gonzalez is having now with Maduro. And because that's a democracy, the results were the ones that people were expecting. So that is why that is how it is to have an election in a dictatorship. That even though everyone knows that Edmundo Gonzalez could win, well, because you are facing an authoritarian regime, you know that those results could not be recognized. So that is why the role of the international community on intervening or using the diplomatic tools is very important. And as I said earlier, having the armed forces obeying the Constitution.
Christopher, since we're talking about...
Mohammed?
Yeah, go ahead. I was going to ask you something, but go ahead.
Yeah, so one of the things, first of all, I mean, seeing the people queue up for these elections, and Paola's alluded to this as well, literally, they started yesterday, is inspiring. In a region, in a world now, we worry about the decline of democracy. To watch people turn out, endure heat, waiting in line, even at the risk of having their votes potentially stolen, is truly inspiring. It should be inspiring not just for Venezuelans, but also for the world, especially when, by the way, Venezuela, the Maduro government disinvited the European Union from sending election observers, but then sent invited Russian and Chinese election observers, not countries well known for their electoral standards. But this indicates, too, that this is not just about the region or Venezuelans who are deeply suffering. This is also about geopolitics, about this coalition of malign regimes that are strengthening their ties and really doubling down on not just trying to suppress their own citizens, but to remake the global order very much in their favor against sort of the Western international liberal order.
Paola, let me ask you, what is the mood on the ground? What are you hearing from voters? Are they excited to be out there, expressing who they want to be the next president? Do they believe that their vote will actually count? What is the mood?
Well, that's a wonderful question. And I just voted half an hour ago, and you can see democratic joy in the streets. People are doing peaceful their lines, respectfully, pacific, constitutionally, civic reactions. Even though we know these elections are far from being fair or free, it's amazing, and it's really moving to see the democratic commitment of the Venezuelan people all around the country. This is from the poorest and rural sectors to the urban and big cities in the country. So as Chris said, and it's really moving to hear him saying that, since yesterday night, we've seen big lines outside the electoral centers to vote. And that's all what we are asking. We're asking to vote and go back to democracy in a peaceful way. And the answer, if it's going to happen or not, the ball, Nicolas Maduro has the ball. I mean, he needs to make the good decisions to let us make our vote a way to go back to democracy.
Christopher, you were talking a couple of minutes ago about geopolitics and the role that plays in all of this. And I want to ask you specifically about the relationship between the U.S. and Venezuela, because sometimes it can be a little hard to figure out exactly what's going on. The U.S., of course, imposed very harsh sanctions, which contributed to the economic despair in Venezuela. Then some of them were lifted. It seems in the past few months that some of them were reimposed. Where are things right now when it comes to the U.S. and their sanctions and the promise of either potentially lifting sanctions if there's one outcome or maybe imposing more sanctions if there's another outcome in this election?
So first of all, is in 2019, the Trump administration imposed what it called maximum pressure sanctions, which prohibited the investment by foreign companies in the all-important Venezuelan oil and gas sector, which represents 90% of its exports. Probably still does, but the amount has shrunk considerably. And also prevented or made it illegal for Venezuela to sell its oil and gas on the international market, although it did so through pirated schemes with China, with Iran, and with Russia. But with the Biden administration, to try to incentivize a return to the negotiating table for Maduro, and then also realizing that the elections were coming up in 2024, the Biden administration signaled very strongly that it was willing to lift some of those sanctions if the Maduro government committed to free and fair elections and a set of conditions around those free and fair elections. And those were announced on October 17th, October 18th, the next day, the U.S. announced a series of limited sanctions with the potential of snapback. Very shortly thereafter, the Maduro government didn't really follow those commitments, but the U.S. decided it wanted to commit and stay on that road, believing, again, this could be an exit. So it did return some of those sanctions in April of this year. But the bet was placed that eventually people wanted to vote, and that the risk was higher to completely go back to those maximum pressure sanctions and let Maduro provide another excuse for him to call off the whole process. And I think what we're seeing now is, excuse perhaps a weird metaphor, but I think we're seeing the toothpaste is out of the tube. It's going to be impossible for Maduro, whatever happens, to put it back in. But if he tries, there's going to be that threat of sanctions return, and that will severely dampen his room for maneuver, even within his inner circle and within his own political party.
All right, well, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to all of our guests, Paola de Aleman, David Smolansky, and Christopher Sabatini. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.